Hey guys, today we're talking about epistemology, a word I'm not going to use very much after this, but basically it's the branch of philosophy that deals with how we know what we know. And at its most basic, I'm not going to get into transcendental idealism or anything quite yet, but at its most basic, we know of the world by perceiving it and conceiving it. And actually, there's a third way of knowing that is distinct from sense perception and intellectual conception, but it brings in consciousness itself and kind of a strange loop. But before we get there, perception is the easiest thing to understand because sense perception is just we see and we learn. We watch and learn, monkey see, monkey do, and it's the easiest domain. I mean, we swim around this domain. Some people think the perceptual domain is an illusion though, and that's absurd because people stub their toes on coffee tables all the time. The perceptual realm is somewhat illusory because our senses evolved in an environment in a certain way, and so sometimes perception can be illusory, and also that sometimes it can be downright false. So when we watch a sunset, we actually see the sun go down. That's the perception, but that's actually not what's taking place. We know what's really taking place because we also have access to a conceptual order. We actually can conceive the idea that the Earth is spinning on its axis and it's just spinning backwards. The sun really isn't going down, like perception would have you know. But anyways, in the conceptual realm, mathematics and logic reign supreme there. Both the perceptual order and the conceptual order have relative degrees of truth value because you can find illusions in both realms. So in perception, like we saw with the sun, that's kind of an illusion. Actually, that's completely false. That's not true. The sun really is not moving down. But as far as illusions go, your brain tricks you into thinking or seeing things that aren't really there, that are not the case. So it's an actual illusion in one sense, but it's not completely false because it's what you're seeing. And also in the conceptual domain, there's also illusions here too, because people have all sorts of beliefs and ideas that do not have any sort of perceptual referent. And if you can't test your ideas by showing it to be the case in the world, then it might not really be the case. So that's where science is the strongest, because science has to test by experiment. It's the fundamental axiom of science, basically, but it's necessary. So in science, you have the perceptual and conceptual orders. They not only intermingle with one another, but they need to agree with one another. The perceptual realm is not an illusion. It's absurd to think that what we experience in perception is an illusion just because perceiving can be illusory. And the conceptual, and some people think that because they prefer the conceptual domain over the perceptual domain. But really, both exist. And there's actually a third way of knowing we're going to get to. A funny example we can talk about right now is we can see how these two orders sometimes don't agree with one another, and it can lead to all sorts of nonsense. So we have the flat earthers, a real society that believe we live on a plate, which is kind of silly. But really what they're doing is they're doing a very elaborate mental tricks because these people have learned to trust perception too much. Because I'm sure you never have either, but I've never personally experienced a spherical Earth. I've seen pictures, of course, but that's not why that's not why I know we live on a sphere. People that have an understanding of the force of gravity and how it pulls everything into it, and people who look at the moon and consider the way that the shadows play over the face of it as the month goes on, kind of realizes that the moon at least must be a half of a sphere. So why not just realize it like half a sphere would be absurd and understand that the moon is a sphere? And why, if that's how gravity works and pulls everything into a spherical shape, then why would the Earth be any different? Anyways, these people just believe in the perceptual realm. Flat earthers favor the perceptual order because they go up in airplanes and they see a flat horizon, and then they will invent concepts to explain this precept, which is kind of absurd, but really they can't trust conception. even though they make up really elaborate concepts to explain their precepts. It's kind of silly, but then you have people that are opposite, and they favor the conceptual domain, and they walk around saying, oh, the perceptual domain is an illusion because there's like our senses are somewhat illusory sometimes, and the sun really isn't going down and all this, which is absurd. Like, the perceptual domain is as real, if not, both domains are real, and they both supply human beings with knowledge about the world, but both have their own inherent flaws, and that's why it's up to philosophy and science to gather up the truth and try and figure out what really is the case. Okay, so conception and perception are the major two domains of human knowledge, but Franklin Merrell-Wolff, one of the greatest American philosophers, once wrote a book asserting a third way of knowledge that is distinct from sense perception and conception, but it also brings in consciousness itself to illustrate that there's a novel way of knowing your world or your experience that is somewhat distinct from either of those. He calls this third function introception to distinguish it from conception and perception, and he doesn't mean intuition or introspection. But introception he defines loosely as when consciousness folds back upon itself towards its source, illuminating itself. Now this is a really curious and odd kind of definition, to bring in consciousness and strange loop it and flip it back on itself. But we can also see this when Evan Thompson, the cognitive scientist, he's actually talking about here open awareness meditation, and he writes, through this practice, one comes to appreciate the distinction between awareness itself, the luminous or open and unobstructed quality of the mind, and the changing contents of awareness, the particular thoughts, emotions, and sensations that come and go from moment to moment. Here we can see that Evan Thompson is making a distinction between awareness itself and the contents of awareness. So consciousness itself and the contents of consciousness. Then, moving back to Franklin Merrell-Wolff, he writes, elsewhere I have suggested the term introception to represent this function. It is to be understood as the process whereby consciousness turns upon itself and moves towards its source. Introception, when successful, leads to a state such that consciousness becomes its own content, that is, a consciousness that is divorced from its objective reference. By this means, the self as source of consciousness can be realized without being transformed into a subtle object, as a me. Later on, Franklin Merrell-Wolff writes, it has already been stated that when introception is carried far enough, the self and the divine other coalesce in a self having a highly transcendent character. It is the union of the subject to consciousness and its content. It is not contained by space, time, and the world of sensible objects, but is like a space that contains and comprehends all of these. In this way, we can see what he means by introception is a novel function in consciousness that is somewhat different from sense perception and conception, because you don't externally perceive and know something, nor are you conceiving anything, like you're not working through some mathematical problem and you arrive at the understanding and a eureka moment. Rather, what he means by introceptive realization is when within yourself you have an experience where you realize that you are the master that makes the grass green, to use a Zen koan, and you are the very entity that brings the world into existence for yourself, but as yourself. It's you all the way down, and it's a connection between how you and the world bring experience itself about. And this is where the subject and object, they dissolve into an experience that is absolutely blissful, because one then feels or discovers themselves to be completely one with the world. And this is an experience that has been written about throughout every culture and society for our entire history, and it has many different names in many different cultures. And of course it is also the Enlightenment experience. It's called Samadhi in the Middle East, and the Buddhists refer to it as Nirvana. Oh, actually the Buddhists call it the clear light too. And the Dalai Lama talks about remembering the clear light, because you're not always in this rare state of consciousness. You're usually in the standard waking state, which as the subject-object dichotomy is instantiated. But when that line dissolves between those two entities, it leads to one of the most beautiful experiences a human being can have. Introception is the greatest philosophical exposition of the Enlightenment experience ever written by a somewhat unsung philosopher, Merrell-Wolff, and he writes about this in 2 books, one called Consciousness Without an Object, and also Transformations in Consciousness. And this is where he talks about introception as an epistemological way of knowing the world. And I think it establishes as true a universal ground floor. It's a fundamental experience. It is a novel state of consciousness that is itself a way of knowing. Thanks for watching.